This is the Good Morning ISLA 200 show.
This podcast was prepared by the Fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamic history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
So welcome everybody to another episode of Good Morning ISLA 200. I'm joined here by my fellow teammates. Everybody take a second to introduce yourselves by name.
Hi, I'm Leylin. Hi, I'm Nina.
Hello, I'm Karosh Fatahi.
Fantastic. And I am your host today. I am Miriam. And in all honesty, we're going to approach this with a little bit more of a discussion, a little bit more of a laid back dialogue, because I'm going to be honest, from working with you guys throughout the semester, I've had so many questions that I wanted to ask you. One thing that's interesting is coming from a Montreal perspective, this is a city with a lot of diversity, and especially a city that's marked by its ability to maintain one identity through the umbrella of identity, meaning that everybody can exist within their own space, fully within their own culture, and still maintain that capacity to be a Montrealer wholly. And so I wanted to apply this type of mindset and to question, how can we, as Muslims, as people influenced by Islam, as members of the Islamic faith, how do we navigate the shared space of Islam from a diverse background of cultures? So one thing that's really interesting for me is, and I'm going to say this fully, this is going to be a conversation about what I'm interested in and what I've been wanting to ask. I come from a background where both of my parents are reverts to Islam and from cultures that are not traditionally associated with Islam. My mother, is Portuguese, came from a very devout Catholic background. Same thing with my father, coming from a very devout Catholic background. And so my specific relationship with Islam has always been very theological, very academic. It was a by the book, textbook learning process. And so it's very interesting for me that we have so many people featured in this group who their experience of Islam is almost entirely cultural, whereas their more direct academic tradition there is not necessarily directly associated with Islam. So if I'm not mistaken, we have two people in this group, Kurash and Lalan. So can you explain to the audience, what is your background and how is that influenced by Islam?
So, hi again. I am very Turkish. Like not only ethnically, but I grew up there. I grew up in Istanbul my whole life. I just came here for university. I grew up in a Muslim household, I would say. I'm gonna touch up on it more, but I've had my dad's side and my mom's side had both different views on Islam. So I grew up in the dynamic balance between them.
And would you say that Turkish culture and its relationship to Islam, can somebody fully understand Turkish culture without having any knowledge of Islam?
No, not at all. Because when you think about it, Islam goes back in Anatolia to the 7th century. So if you're before the 7th century, before Islam, then yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But not right now, not at all.
Great. So a little bit of a deeper question there. Do you think somebody could understand you fully without having any knowledge of Islam, since you are informed by your culture as a Turkish person?
No, because even though I wouldn't consider myself a practicing Muslim, my character has developed in an environment that was based on Islamic principles, which has influenced my upbringing and my morals and everything, and my principles.
Yeah, so one term that came up in our conversations as a group consistently was the term culturally Muslim. And Kurash, I remember last time we had the discussion, it was something that interested you. So I'm asking from an Iranian perspective, from somebody who's raised in Persian culture, how do you relate to Islam and what does Islam mean to you?
So for me, I grew up in a Persian household in Boston. I wasn't surrounded by Muslims because most of my family migrated to Canada after the Iranian Revolution. From the culture that I had, which was my family, the sense I got was that it was very connected. The community was all connected to each other because even when my mother was growing up back in Iran, she would always tell me that they did traditions together. I think it was Persian New Year, but they would like hop over like a lit candle, like a fire. And I really like that part of the culture because I feel like it's good to grow up around because, you know, it connects you to your family better. And I think that's really important for somebody that's young.
Yeah, beautiful. And going back to the question that I asked before, talking about your mother and your mother's family, and their deep tradition with Persian culture, with Iranian culture, do you think that they could be understand and their point of view could be understand their worldview without an understanding of Islam?
I think so because although
Mhm,
my parents would embrace Persian culture, they weren't very religious. They were religious, but our culture wasn't just based around religion. It was based around Persian traditions that were, I guess, based on religion, but we would really focus on the activities, the ability to unite everybody together. So it wasn't
mhm,
really, we weren't really doing the activities because of the religion, I would say. And
mhm.
so I feel like people could understand the activities that we did because it wasn't just focused on the religion, it was just focused on the cultural gathering.
And going into Nina, you come from a French background, right? And I think what Kurash just kind of touched on this idea of being able to see culture beyond Islam. France doesn't traditionally have a long, long history of being directly influenced, identity-wise by Islam, and yet it's kind of impossible to have a modern day conversation on French identity and nationalism without having a conversation with it, without the topic of Islam being touched. And so I'm wondering, yeah, what was your view of Islam as well, and how do you relate to what the other two are saying?
Yeah, I think what is interesting with France is that it's very much related to its colonial history.
Hmm.
So, because France colonized a lot of countries in North Africa, there were a lot of immigrants coming in the 60s, 70s, and it like continues throughout.
Hmm.
So, and I think that these kind of immigration cycles very much influenced French culture, and that's why now is very much influenced by Islam.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And relating that to the same questions that I asked them, do you think it's possible to understand the modern French political context without having an understanding of Islam?
I would say no, because it's a constant kind of debate of how
Hmm.
religion is viewed and how religion is not only Islam but religions in general, but because there's a big community there in France.
Hmm.
So I think it's very much always a discussion in the like political side. So I wouldn't say so.
Yeah,
More on
I
the
think
political side. Yeah.
on the political side at least. And I
Yeah, I
think
would say.
that's super interesting because though we all come from extremely different backgrounds, right? Whether it be Iranian, Persian, Turkish, French, it seems like a conversation that's constantly around those states and that identity has something to do with Islam. Whether that be for a historical context in the context of Turkey, right, where there's kind of that direct link, or more modern context in which, France, it's a constant conversation, or even exploring Karash's opinion, which is, that Iranian and Persian culture can as actually misunderstood as being too influenced by Islam and as being viewed as something that culturally can be understood without that lens. So I wanted to bring into the next point, which is what exactly were you guys looking for from this class? With you guys having, like you said, backgrounds that were very much situated around the conversation of Islam, what were you looking for from the class? And what did you find was different? It challenged your view, or what did you find reinforced it?
I think it more came out of curiosity in the first place because I
Mm,
didn't know much. So, and I think it's always a good opportunity to learn about a new culture or religion. So that was kind of the starting point. I thought it gave me like a really good broad introduction. So
mhm.
yeah.
And Lalin, you coming from a Turkish background, like you said, that's so heavily influenced by Islam. What did you think thinking taking an introduction class was gonna teach you that you didn't already know?
I'm doing an Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies minor,
Hmm.
and I think my goal there in general, and also this class specifically, is to explore Islam without the culture
Mm,
because it's so embedded in the culture. And at this point, I've just lost what's Anatolian culture, what's Turkish culture, and what's Islamic culture.
hmm
And I just want to explore Islam as a religion separated from the other parts of it. And I also want, Islam has always been a communal thing for me, and I also want it to be an individual relationship thing for myself as well. So I
mm.
think that's another goal I'm going forward to. I just want to explore my own path with religion because I've never had a chance to do that back home.
That's so interesting that you're saying that it's an individualistic journey as much as it is a communal journey.
Hmm.
I think that when we look at the Sunnah, when we look at Hasa, when we look at Tasfir, especially when we look at Hadith, there's always a focus on the communal aspect of Islam, of viewing the Ummah. That said, there's a Hadith that says that the Ummah is one body and that one part is affected, the rest of it feels it as well, right? But
Exactly.
also the importance of having an individual relationship with the religion is never ignored within the literature and the tradition. So
Yeah.
I'm interested, Korash, you as well as somebody that's coming back from a culture that's heavily influenced by that people perceive as being heavily influenced by it, right? What were you looking to explore in an introduction to Islam?
Since I grew up in a household that they didn't fully like show me Islamic culture, I mean we had events we would do, but it wasn't to the extent of my family in Toronto that was surrounded by Persians and they would be fully embracing the culture. So I was looking to get out of the class a better understanding of, what Islam really is, kind of the culture. And what I found was, well, I learned a lot from the class, but what I really found interesting was that the translations of the Quran and
Mm,
how it can be interpreted in many different ways, whether it's in French, Turkish, Persian, and how that could influence people's understandings of it. I think that was like the most important aspect that I learned
hmm
because it gave me a better understanding of how people in different cultures are going to view Islam.
I think that's super interesting to talk about language, and it's a good segue. Great alley-oop right there into our next segment, which is to talk about our sensory exploration and experience of Islam. So I'm interested in what was your experience with Islam from visual to sound to taste? How do you relate those things to your culture? And how do you think those things might be related to your culture in a way that is misunderstood by people, right? So you going in and talking about how you weren't immersed in it and wanted to have kind of a better understanding in language. We come from different backgrounds when it comes to language here. I think the only one that's shared is English, which might not even be most of our native tongues. So I'm wondering, language as a sound, language as, one of the most important expressions of culture. How did you guys feel that those translations accurately depicted your language's interpretation of the Quran? Or how do you feel that those translations that we looked at in that first assignment might have altered the way that your cultures interact with Islam? Well, and I see you ready to go at this question. How did
I
you feel
am.
about how did you feel about like the Turkish translations and contrasting that with the other languages that we explored?
It's interesting. I've started to learn Ottoman Turkish,
Mm-hmm.
which is Turkish in an Arabic alphabet. That's basically it.
Wow. Okay. I didn't even know that existed.
But it's the same language, just influenced. One is influenced more by Arabic and Persian, and then the other has a lot of Western and European influence in it as
Mm-hmm.
well. Turkish is just such a combination of a bunch of languages.
Yeah.
Geographically, think of Turkey and just in between everything. That's
Mm-hmm.
the language we speak.
Mm.
Like, that's exactly the language we speak. And that's why we have so many ways of telling stuff and explaining stuff, and so many different nuances we can use. I thought it was interesting to see all the different Turkish translations.
I'm interested in the things that you said right there, because when we were looking at translations of ayats and looking at translations of surahs, right, there were times where I would see the frustration in everybody's eyes, where there just wasn't that perfect translation. There wasn't that sense that was perfectly captured, right? And I think as somebody that speaks French, Nina, you can touch on this as well. There's just some expressions that don't exist in English in the same way, right? And so I'm wondering, when you read the translation of the Quran in the surahs that we were looking at in French, and then looking at the translation in English, right? Did you gain some type of new perspective from the difference that exists between both of them?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I don't know if it's the right word, but frustrating maybe to not like understand the Arabic, so I don't like
Mm-hmm.
fully understand what they're trying to say, because I think a translation always kind of takes a little bit something away, even if
Mm-hmm.
it's like a more accurate translation. But yeah, definitely was interesting to see the contrast between the English and the French. Definitely.
Yeah. And Kurash, going into you with language here, how did you feel about the translations? You already talked about how interesting it was, but where did you see the gaps, or how did it brighten anything or enlighten you as to a different interpretation?
The biggest thing I took from it was that it made me more interested to learn the original language of the Quran,
Mm.
which is Arabic. Yeah, I feel like I'm missing something if I'm just reading it in English. So I don't know, in the future, I feel like I would want to learn Arabic just to be able to understand how the original text was written.
I want to go into more of that visual aspect of it as well, right? I mean, I think Arabic as a language is something that's quite distinct in its script, especially from more Latin languages and more Latin scripts, right? It's written in a different way. And I think that extends itself to a lot of aspects of Islamicate, right? The architecture is different. Cities look different. The way of life is different. So I'm wondering, from your guys' individual perspective, do you have anything that you've seen from your own cultures that you can tell is just so distinctly Islamic, or that has such an influence from Islam just from it looking different?
When you ask the question, the first thing that pops into my mind is Ramadan in Istanbul.
Mm,
I think that is one of the most special things I've ever seen in my life. And
mm,
I always cherish that. In the last few years, I was here all the time in Ramadan and I was so frustrated about it. I have like an exact image that pops into my mind. It's a mosque. There is this like long table in the
mm-hmm,
open, and it's just free meals, and everyone can show up and just sit down and eat.
That's
And
beautiful.
that's in the background, the voices of the azan and everything, and then
Mm-hmm.
everyone just chatting around. It's just such a communal experience. And I feel like it brings everyone together. That's something I really like about it.
I think that's such a beautiful thing to talk on, because that is something that I personally, as somebody who considers themselves a practicing, Sunni Muslim, I've never experienced that in my life. Though I'm an avid practitioner of Ramadan, it's a core aspect of who I am. But it's such a beautiful expression of the Sunnah, which is to share
Yeah.
meals. Meals are considered better as having more hasanat within them when you share them with people. You know what I mean? To give food to the needy, especially during the period of Ramadan. That's one of the, highest forms of like sadaqah that you could do, charity that you could do. And yeah, that's a beautiful, I would pay to experience that. I'm envious a little bit right now. I'm envious a little bit, I won't lie, you know? But I want to also hear from like Kurash's opinion. What's something that, as a Persian, as an Iranian, what would you say you and your family view as like kind of iconic visuals of Islam?
Well, mine would actually be more of an audio, or I guess you could visualize it if you're seeing someone do this. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like music, especially I feel like growing up, whenever I would hear music when I was with my family in Toronto, which was all Persian,
Mm-hmm.
and it would be like during Nowruz, which is like Persian New Year,
Mm-hmm.
and there would be religious things that we would do and play music. And even when people just do prayers, I remember in class we were listening to a video of somebody doing a prayer and like they were singing. So that's kind of unique and that like reminds me of Islam.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, because I think that the sounds of Islam are so particular.
Mm.
Listening to the adhan like we did in class, a lot of cultures that are influenced by Islam have those very similar, like, cadences and rhythms that are influenced within their culture, whether that be in like Maghrebian culture, North African, even if you go to like, the south of Spain and Andalusia and hear about, Andalucista and all those types of like musical genres, completely influenced by Arab scales and traditionally from the voyage of Muslim empires into the region. So I think it's so interesting that, as somebody who doesn't identify as like a practicing Muslim, that hearing something so distinctly Islamic as the adhan reminded you of the music of back home. So I'm wondering also, like, Lalin, what ways do you think that sound is related to your experience with Turkey?
It's special. The Azan is something that it's just a regular thing now, and when you come here, you realize it's not, which
Mm-hmm.
is so different. But I think when we talked about like Islamic influence in our cities and everything in our cultures, I thought a lot about the mosques and the architectures behind it.
Mm.
And I grew up in Istanbul, and it has just so many influences in terms of architecture and cities, and it's just everything thrown in together, and it forms Istanbul. I just thought about like Hagia Sophia, for example. I don't know if you
Mm.
guys know
Yes,
it, but
of course.
it was a church in the Byzantine era when Constantinople was the capital. And then after the conquest of Istanbul, it was converted into a mosque. After that, when the Republic was formed, it was then a museum. And now at 2020, it's back to a mosque.
Mm-hmm.
So it has so many different cultures inside of it. I wouldn't call it a mosque. Because, for example, when you enter, you see these like icons. They are all painted over, probably like
Mm-hmm.
decades and decades ago. And now the paint is just dissolving, and you can see the
Mm-hmm.
figures behind it, which is so special. And you can understand that when it was turned into a mosque, from
Yeah,
Sunni perspective, they don't
definitely
have all
from
these, yeah,
yeah, the
all
dominant
these,
Sunni like madhabs would definitely agree that, having
yeah.
imagery in a mosque is kind of counterintuitive for sure. And so moving on from, kind of our intrinsic or sense related experience of Islam, I wanted to ask you guys from a more individual level, right? What is your experience of the way that Islam is acted out? So I'm interested in coming from cultures and countries where law is very important. I think all three of the countries that you guys come from, law is a heavily important subject, right? When we're talking about laïcisme and secularism as a core principle of France, whether we're talking about, like you said before, the transitionary of kind of conservatism and the importance of Islam in Turkish dialogue politically, as well as it oftentimes having been a back and forth of being a primary feature of it, or even talking about Persian culture and the Iranian context of, Shiism and the Ayatollah and that entire network. So how do you guys experience Islam being acted out in the more rigid sense, rather than talking about just as, as an experience or as an individual experience? How do your societies look shaped by Islam?
For me, Ottoman history was based on Sharia law. And
Mm,
then when the Republic was formed, what happened was Turkish civil code was created, and it's a judicial system based on Swiss law, so it's a secular
mm-hmm,
system. But at the same time, culturally, there is like this plurality. For example, like more conservative people can do their family law in a more religious way, and the
mm,
Turkish government kind of accepts that.
mm-hmm.
So you see that plurality between like actual like formal law and then the culturally adapted way that people use it.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that because, like you said, the Ottoman Empire as an example of caliphate and the example of having, a strong caliph.
Yeah.
I'm wondering those outwards, expressions of like family court and like you're talking about, or like the more individual ways that people create systems to further practice their Islam to the way that they view it, right? What was your
hmm
relationship with the term Sharia? Ooh, scary term, scary term, scary term. There is no right answer.
I think what it is, it's just never talked under the umbrella term Sharia.
Mm,
So what I discovered after studying Islam as academically was
mm-hmm,
that things that I have culturally been exposed to in terms of, I would say, cultural norms, and then those principles were based on Sharia, which was interesting to me because I never knew that those came from there, you
Ah,
know?
so you discovered Sharia's
The other
influence
way around.
retroactively. Wow.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which
Wow,
is
that's
very
interesting.
interesting to me because, like,
Mm-hmm.
especially family court and family law and all those,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a child of a divorced parents and all of
Yeah.
that. And when you look at that, it's just so similar.
Mm.
and it's just very interesting. So
I think that's
Sharia
so wow.
came later to me, and this is a safe answer for the question. But
Mhm.
yeah, that's how it happened.
Wow, I think that's so interesting that you are probably one of the only people here who have like a direct experience of an attempt at Sharia, and yet
Yeah.
you didn't even know it was Sharia. You know, your life has been guided by Sharia. I mean, you're talking about divorced parents here, and that you know influences a child's upbringing and whatnot. And it's only later on in your like university studies that you're like, wait, hold on, wait a minute.
Exactly.
Who
That's how it
decided when I
happened.
go to mom, and who decides when I? Interesting. That's so interesting. So Nina, I also want to ask you about this, the term Sharia. Ooh, what was
Yeah,
your relationship with that, and what's like the broader conversation related to that?
yeah, I think the broader conversation is that it's maybe viewed as like more of a scary word, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of the people don't know what it is, so it's
Yeah,
often misused and a bit thrown out everywhere. Oh, this is that, but it's actually not. People maybe kind of have the wrong perceptions of it also.
from a French perspective, right? Understanding that secularism and the French identity is so important and such a fundamental aspect of it historically, and that Sharia is something that's often discussed in politics. So I'm wondering, from your experience, how do you feel that Sharia is discussed in France? And how is that similar to the way that people actually feel about it? And how does it potentially differ from the way that people actually relate to Sharia?
I would say so going back to like the secular thing. So
Hmm.
France is like a very secular state since the French Revolution, so it has deeper history. But I think in today's reality, it's a bit struggling with the secularism because it's basically saying that you cannot show any religious sign or like have like the hijab or like have like a cross necklace, for example, in like a public or like public institutions or like in school.
Hmm.
So I think it's a very conflicting reality of what like the state imposed with the secular idea and the like realities of people practicing their religion.
Yeah, I think that's something I can definitely 100% relate to as somebody who's born and raised in Montreal. In the past, you know, I'd say 10 to 15 years of my life, I've seen the public and political side of its relationship to Islam being completely different, and just shifting towards a more, dare I say, Islamophobic, overly controversial, rejectory approach to, um, you know, a dialogue with Islam or a dialogue about Islam, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the key words that's always touched on in, you know, Quebec politics is definitely the term laïcisme, which I think,
Yeah.
you know,
Oh,
France,
yeah,
we
always
got it from
talked
y'all.
about.
We got
Yeah.
it from y'all, you
Yeah, I
know.
think very
It's
inspired by like
very,
Quebec
very inspired.
politics, very inspired by French.
Absolutely, and that's that colonial relationship, you know. But like you were talking about, the importance of religious symbolism and how an expression of being Quebecois politically
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
cannot coexist with an expression of religion in the sense of you
Mm-hmm.
cannot be a public worker representing the government and
Mm-hmm.
have those symbols. So directly
Yeah.
putting yourself politically in opposition, you know, to
Mm-hmm.
that. And as somebody who has been born and raised in Montreal, in Quebec, it's interesting to see such an integral part of my religion and my identity being said to be the exact opposite of where I was born or what I am as well. The way that politics tries to frame it is that you can't be Muslim and Quebecois. And yet, I think we see a day to day in Montreal life. You can't separate Islam from Montreal culture, you know?
Yeah, I think
Uh,
that experience is very similar to many like Muslim in France, I would
mhm.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the modern definition changes, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering also, Korash, you know, tying you into this, talking about, I mean, I think Iran has one of the most unique expressions of Islamic or an interpretation of Islamic law, right? Being a dominant Shia country, having things like the Ayatollah, having things like, you know, Sevener and Twelver, Shiaism playing a dominant role in the political conversation day to day and just the political expression of the country, right? And you talked about it, lightly touching on it before, the Iranian Revolution. So I'm wondering your family's experience of the Iranian Revolution, right? What aspects did your family see change over time in relation to Islam and law in Iran?
I remember one time they were telling me so the new regime would instill more Islamic law. And so
Hmm.
one thing they did was they forced women to wear the head covers. So that was one thing they implemented that would I remembered. And I thought that was interesting how they like enforce the religion with government, because there's always the question of should religion be with government?
I think that's extremely interesting given the fact that, what Nina and I just touched on is exactly the kind of opposite, right? Rather than the government enforcing a religious symbol, kind of being the opposite and saying a government completely rejecting a religious symbol. I think the hijab is an interesting conversation in all aspects of Islam. I think what I find also interesting from this conversation that is kind of a takeaway is that it seems like the very same expressions and topics have very different meanings for all of us. When we talked about what does it mean to look like a Muslim, talking about the hijab here, it being present or not present, talking about the sounds of our countries and where we come from in our cultures, and the influence of the adhan and of recitation being there or not, values as well, going back to that idea of during Ramadan feeding people and so on and so forth. So I wanted to pivot to a conversation more about philosophy and about the values that we as individuals bring with us. My personal relationship with Islam was one much more rooted in Islamic philosophy and understanding the religion from that standpoint, right? The morals, the values, the more academic thickness of it there. And so I was exposed to thinkers like Ibn Sina, I was
Yes.
exposed to thinkers like Ibn Talib, hugely influential within, the Turkish context as well in the golden age of Islam. And one thing that always struck to me is that I was also very much exposed to Western philosophy and looking at things like Descartes and the cognito, the idea of I think, therefore I am. I've always loved this conversation because there's a lot of overlap between the East and the West philosophically that is not acknowledged because of the religious difference. So one thing that I want to ask you guys about is how do you think that your personal philosophies are informed by your cultures? And in what ways did you learn from the class that those are very similar to Islam or very different? So personally, I could say, for example, my education on Ibn Sina, right, and his understanding, his creation of the floating man experiment, his attempt to prove that the soul exists by limiting the two other forms of knowledge, being deductive knowledge, your ability to reason, and so on and so forth, and your empirical knowledge, your senses that allow you to see. So should a man exist in a void of any senses, unable to see, taste, touch, so on and so forth, and thus unable to reason, how does he know he exists? And he would know that he exists through his intrinsic knowledge, his intrinsic experience of the soul. And that always reminded me of Descartes with I think, therefore I am. Should you remove all of your senses and your deduction, how would you know that one exists? How would you know that you're not in a simulation? Through the fact that you experience thought. The experience of thought is proof of your existence. So I'm wondering, from a French perspective, from a Turkish perspective, did you have any of those moments where you're just like, Islam is quite similar value-wise to me? Or did you have any moments where you're like, hold on, everything I thought I knew about my culture is kind of, in those things that are integral to me, very opposite to Islam, and I don't see the similarities there.
For me, what I would say is from my background, my dad's side was very conservative. I wouldn't even say conservative in the sense of religion, just more of a conservative mindset. I would go to more restrictive. And I thought that was how religion was practiced everywhere, how Islam was practiced everywhere.
Mm,
And that was my understanding of it. I didn't fit. And I
mhm,
thought I didn't fit in Islam then, because that's Islam. That's
mm,
that's that's what I knew Islam was. That side of my family was the definition of Islam that I had.
mhm,
And after coming here and just studying Islam and its values and its principles, the giving aspect of it and the respect aspect of it really spoke to me, because I just base morally myself on like giving and helping people, which is very cheesy, but it
mhm.
is.
Wow. So your experience of
Um,
your culture and of like, your interpersonal experience of your family and as being informed by Islam led to you having a certain view on what it meant to be a Muslim and you not fitting in with
yes.
your cultural context with that, like, the term that you used before, being culturally Muslim, you're not fitting into that,
Hmm.
made you think that you could not fit into being a Muslim. You could not fit into Islam.
So my mom's side, on the other hand, was culturally Muslim. That's what
Hmm.
I said. Culturally Muslim. That was
Culturally
culturally
Muslim.
Muslim, And then my dad's side was practicing Muslim. So
Ah,
think of it like that. That's
mm,
why I didn't like the term practicing Muslim, because I was like, that's the definition for me. That's
that
restrictive.
practice wasn't for you,
That
and therefore
practice,
Islam wasn't for you.
yes,
Wow.
exactly. And my mom's side just valued all these principles. And we had these holidays. I loved them. And I don't know, they touched a place that I really liked and they sparked something in me.
And do you
Um,
feel that through this class, and your now more formal education, I suppose, or like
uh-huh.
university level education, and developing, like you said before, that individual relationship, do you still feel that you don't fit in Islam?
No.
Wow,
Um,
interesting.
I think coming to Montreal was also a big thing,
Mm-hmm.
living by myself and studying, formally studying Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Those three were really influential in my journey with Islam in general. I
Yeah.
don't know if I would call myself a practicing Muslim right now as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know yet. But
Mm-hmm.
I love the experience of exploring it and nobody restricting me to fit into any certain box. And I think Islam is that. Islam isn't that restrictive box. That's
Mm-hmm.
why I love the religion itself and I love exploring it because it has so many ways that you can incorporate your life into it,
Mm-hmm.
which other religions don't give you the opportunity to do.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's fascinating.
I think it's interesting, really, that you use the word journey because journey is something that's a key feature of Islam. In the Quran, in
Hmm.
the Hadiths, this idea of going on a sirah, of life being a journey, of staying on sirat al-mustaqim, the right path, right? Of constantly
Yes.
being on a war towards that path and being on the right way. This idea of even like the most important, some of the most important moments in Islam have always been journeys from Mecca to Medina, Hajj, Umrah, all these types of things. So viewing our life, we're taught in Islam to view life as a traveler, to be
Hmm.
attached to this dunya, this life like a traveler. And so a relationship with Islam is always a journey. So I think it's so interesting that when you were describing your own path with it, that you use that same terminology, a path towards growth, a path towards a better understanding and in your own individual understanding of it as well.
Yeah.
And to close off this conversation, to end our journey here throughout this podcast, this episode, one, I want to take the time to thank all of you guys for sharing your perspectives and, more importantly, for working alongside each other. I think that this was a fantastic group, and I'm so inspired by the ways that we differ, by the ways that we share space. And going back to that original question of how can so many people or how can different cultures share a space and, share the subject of Islam, share that conversation, that dialogue, and yet have their own space and have that respected. I think we found a really dope balance right here. And this was kind of a micro expression of that thing that we're looking for on a more macro level when we're discussing Islam on the international level, right? And speaking on journeys and the importance of it and life being a journey, this conversation being a journey, our education being a journey, it just brought me back to Surah Fatiha, which is the opening surah of the Quran, in which it says, one of the many translations of it in English, it mentions that in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, all praises for Allah, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship and you alone we ask for help. And very importantly, very empirically, guide us along the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not those you are displeased with or those who are astray. Those lifelines have always had a lot of meaning for me. I repeat them more than 5 times per day. And every single one of my prayers, it begins with that. And it's this reminder that this dunya, this life, is a journey, and that our process through it, our growth in Islam is not something that we should weigh ourselves on the ways in which we fail it, but more be motivated by the ways in which we pursue better and we pursue higher truth and we pursue a better way of living. And I think that regardless of everybody's religious practices, I think that's a beautiful ideology. And we've seen it in practice for the past couple of months within this class and in every episode of this podcast. An attempt to better understand, an attempt to be better guided, an attempt to be of those of knowledge and not be of those who are astray and ignorant. And so I want to commend not only our group, but every other group that produced the podcast. Anyone who's listening right now, I strongly suggest that you go listen to those other podcasts. It's super interesting conversations. And yeah, that'll be the end for us. Our journey ends here, but the lifelong journey of learning never does. Thank you.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.